Northridge. He's a developer, and I asked him to give us a little bit of a perspective about what it takes to really come as a developer to the community. And then I have Ryan Baumtrock, who is with Minnesota Housing, and he's going to talk a little bit about the programs and some of the opportunities that are available. And then I have Levi Haar, who is with the Headwaters Regional Development Commission and is in charge of our owner-occupied rehabilitation programs. So we'll start it out with John, and there are materials. He's brought some bound copies of what he's going to talk about. We didn't do a PowerPoint for him, so if you were interested in grabbing that material, it's over on the table on the side.
Well, thank you, Mary, for having me. I'm John Miscavige. I'm the CEO of Northridge Construction. Just to tell you a little bit about our firm. We own, build, develop, and manage apartment housing, hospitality products, and senior living across the United States. Currently, we've built in 9 states, and we're entertaining projects in California and Florida right now, which is a little bit scary. So, at Northridge, our philosophy is that we try to buy right so we can build right. And what we mean by that is we're a fully vertically integrated firm. We try to buy every product that we use in a building direct to more or less generate as much savings as we can so we can use higher quality materials. We own a lot of the subcontracting firms, from the HVAC firm to the granite company to the wall panel company and to the truss company. And so that allows us to more or less bring our costs down so we can build a better product, which allows us to have better retention. So first off, I'm no speaker, so bear with me. And I'm no expert on rural development either. We did one project in Crookston, Minnesota, that I think was a success for both Crookston and for us at Northridge. And so within my packet, I kind of bullet pointed a lot of the things that the city of Crookston did for us that made it successful, and then on the front end of that, bullet pointed a lot of what the challenge is for developers. And third, I put in there a pro forma just so you guys can kind of understand the economics of what a developer looks at when he's coming to your community. And if you guys want more information on that, I can send you the Excel file, and you guys can modify it as you see fit of really what these people are facing for challenges, and you know, what it's really going to take to get you know, housing done in a community. And so just the rule of thumb that we always use when we look at any marketplace, and I guess you guys could analyze this very quickly yourself, is that look at your community and say, what is the monthly rent of the product that we're trying to generate? And so if it is call it $700 a month, you can roughly, the max all-in cost you can spend is $70,000 on that unit. And so knowing that that's not possible to build in today's world, you know, everywhere we go, the number one thing everyone talks about is affordable housing. Okay, affordable housing, there's 2 ways to get it. Number 1 is subsidize it. And number 2 is to supply a market and create economic collapse. So there is no other way. I mean, the costs are the costs. Nobody's working for less. And I would tell you that the challenges that you have in more rural communities is that your access to labor it's a lot more challenging, and it costs more money to build in a smaller community. And I would think that would be the opposite. The products that we have built have shown that. So I think number 1, let's just talk the challenges that developers do see. This is where my no speaking skills come in. So when I look at a market, the number 1 thing we look at is the liquidity of an asset. And so you take a product in Grand Forks, North Dakota over a product in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis is going to be a much more liquid market. You're going to have institutional buyers. You're going to command higher price points. There's just a lot more people in the market looking to acquire products. So as you look at a Crookston market or even a Brainerd market, it's just the buying pool is going to get much more condensed. So your exit strategies are even more challenging from that aspect. And banks know that, and that's why as you look to these markets, you're not going to achieve the interest rates that you would achieve in, call it, the primary markets as well. Number two is just the rents. You know, I think that's kind of what I touched on, is the rent in your given market high enough to justify the cost of the product. And so if it's not, then that's where you guys have to look at the pro forma and the things that you guys can do to help entice that and enhance that profitability, because that's really what you guys are after. Lack of proven demand, that's the number one reason why I said no to Crookston on every occasion that it was presented to us until the last. And it's just, when you looked at the current rents in the marketplace to what we actually achieved, there was no proven demand. And our banks figured it would take 24 months to lease the project up. And at the end of the day, we outperformed the rents by about 20 to 30% of what we actually thought we would hit. And we leased up in 60 days. So it was pretty astounding. And I think that's probably what everybody faces, is just that anxiety and the fear of, is this product going to perform there? And if it doesn't, then it kind of relates back to the potential exit strategies, and there's no buyers. So that kind of all wavers into people's decisions. As I touched on, the lack of subcontractors, it's just more costly to build in those markets. So that's going to be a limiting factor. Lenders is probably the number one thing that you're going to see, is that you're probably, in Crookston, we were approached by a handful of local lenders, and even at and that was a fairly small project, that was about $3 million to $4 million. Most of the local lenders don't have that lending capacity. And so when we went to Bremer Bank, which was one of our primaries, they are local in the market and did step up to the table. But as you push further and further out, banks that don't have presence don't like to lend in those markets. So given the challenges of a market and the demand there, I think that that's going to drive and command higher interest rates. Right now we're doing deals in Grand Forks and getting interest rates in the 3s. And I would tell you that I don't think you're going to even touch a mid-4 interest rate in a rural market. So another thing that developers look at is, where's the best place to put their capital? And, you know, I would say that right now our company initiatives is that we're really chasing the Southwest. We think that the Phoenix Metro is probably one of the strongest markets to be in, and as well as Orlando, Florida. And those are solely driven by in-migration metrics, where are people moving, and so that's kind of how we decide where we're going to invest the dollars that we have available to put to work. And so if you're going to attract developers to smaller communities, you're probably going to have to basically make it much more attractive. And that is going to be from, call it a cap rate or their return on investment, and get them to more or less come into the marketplace. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what you can do to attract developers, and what Crookston did a lot for us. So the number one thing Crookston came to us with was discounted land. We bought a 3.5-acre site for about, I think it was $1 even. And within that site, they had all the infrastructure, so the roads, the sewers, the water, all that was included, and the water retention. Water retention is probably one of the biggest things we look at as a developer when we go into any city, because it can range as little as $50,000 to accommodate if it's not embedded within the development, or it can be upwards of $600,000. It's underground storm systems, and they're federally mandated, so there's really no ways around them. Another thing that Crookston came to us with was a property tax exemption, and I would say that was a 10-year deal. And so all of those things, guys, and I'll show you, they flow into the pro forma of what generates free cash flow. And so other things with Duluth, Minnesota right now, we're working on a TIF district, and there's varying TIF districts. They're looking at a pay-as-you-go. So that's another option that we've seen highly promoted in the marketplace. assessments that would come from that. They also came in with an interest rate buy-down, which actually made it much more effective for the lending capacity of what we could achieve. And they, I want to say that, I don't know if it was DITA or CHEETA, I don't know what the acronym was, Craig had done it. They came in with a secondary note at the city business level, which helped comprise the equity stack. And then Craig also spent a lot of money on housing studies prior to us getting there that we could use to more or less support the viability of the project to various lenders. So they had really done a nice job. So within the packet, I included a pro forma, but I think if everything is an input and an output to it, and the project that I put in there is a 173 unit apartment complex that we're building in Grand Forks right now. And it just goes to show how tight margins are in this business. And so any of those things that you guys can do from property taxes, so if I could get a property tax assessment or abatement in Grand Forks, it would drastically change our ability to do that project. And so when you really look at the bottom line numbers of these things, we're having to invest about $8 million in cash on the front end of this thing, and it's going to be about, from the time you break ground to the time you stabilize that asset, it's roughly 4 years, because you're looking at about 16 months construction, and then probably in the neck of the woods of a touch over 24 months to get the project stabilized and to hit performer rents. But the free cash flow, call it in your first stabilized years, off $8 million is about $358,000. So you plan on running negative for quite some time. And more or less that's why all of these input costs are really what is the fear of bringing people to the marketplace. So, you know, I would say that I think our project in Crookston was a good representation of what can be done and the outcome of it, but I think the front end challenges are really where most of the problems lie, and really what is your city going to generate in rents. So I would open it up for any questions that I can maybe answer for you. And
John, you discussed challenges in rural, and one I'd like to ask about is one of the challenges I see that we oftentimes have is just the number of units that we can support, and it seems as though there's also an issue with economies of scale. You're talking about a project of 170 units. Oftentimes in the communities we deal with, they have a project in mind that might be able to stretch to get 20 units.
Yep.
I'd just like to get your reaction to what scale is achievable often.
Well, I think that's going to be solely market specific. I mean, there's the challenge that you have from the construction aspect where we would operate is your overall cost of overhead to build a smaller structure is that I can use the same job superintendent and the same project manager to build 20 units as I can 170 units. So the dilution of that cost into the project is much more concentrated in a 20-unit project. So you're going to have to evaluate the contractors that you're physically choosing to do that work. And I think as we have learned in our infancy is that we can do business for so much less on the front end than we can do now. And that really comes down, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know your risks involved. And once you have all the safety programs and all the other, once you've really educated yourself onto the exposure, you really can't do business in that fashion. But more local contractors will do that work and they just don't know. And they might be owner-operators. They might be on-site self-performing. So I think that, you know, I would probably, if you're building the smaller projects, look to the local home builders in a region that, you know, aren't large general contractors, because if we run a project like that the way we would run a project, it's just the economics aren't going to work out. But 20 units, 12 units, all those things are achievable, and I think it really just comes down to cost per unit.
This is, I'm kind of new to the housing game, but in terms of housing studies, what do you consider a relevant time period? For instance, if you have a smaller community under 5,000, let's say, or 2,000 even, when they do a housing study, how long is that relevant for? You're not gonna see giant changes in population or anything like that in a town of that size, unless something really huge is going on. So, how long is that housing study relevant for? I mean, if they have one project in year 1, and then about year 5, they're gonna do something else that's relatively big, is that housing study still relevant, or
Banks usually have them updated annually.
really?
It's traditionally what we've seen. Even when I'm working on in Northeast Minneapolis, the housing study was out of date by about 15 days, and they kicked it back immediately for a reassessment. So, a lot of the lending institutions are gonna kind of clarify that for you.
Okay.
When you're looking at smaller communities, I mean, too, what we looked at is what is the job growth within a community? What are the, you're looking at the horizon to see what good impacts they have coming. And then also what, when you look at geopolitical events, and call it, under a given recession, what does the employment base in that community look like? One market we like a lot is Thief River. I mean, DigiKey's a strong business. They're really globally diverse. You throw a large, call it national recession at the marketplace, we don't see much changing in that community. So, any other questions?
How did that interest rate breakdown look?
I want to say that there was the bank had submitted an initial interest rate, and then there was a gap that they paid it down to, is what I thought it was. But Ryan, my partner, is the one that did the deal with Craig, so I'd have to defer to him for a better explanation of what took place.
Have you looked at opportunity zones?
Own 3 sites on them, and I sat in a lot of meetings on them right now, and there's a lot of legislation that's not clear in regards to the tax codes. So we have not moved forward with any of our projects yet. We're looking at some of the deferral aspects. The biggest issue that they have is that in 2025 the tax gain triggers, and so their mechanism for funding those markets really is to look for people that are looking to defer exchange dollars. And so it's really tough for people to understand that you put your money into this transaction, and let's say you came into it today, at 2025 that transaction unwinds. So it's not a full deferral, and you more or less have to be committed to the investment for 10 years, because you're going to see the tax dollars due, which is a major issue if you don't have access to your capital. So if your money is invested in that deal, 2025, let's just say you brought $10 million into a transaction, and the tax consequences are $3 million, but you don't have access to any of your capital because it's invested in this opportunity zone project. That now people are looking at second notes into these projects. I mean, there's just a lot of challenges that come with it. But the back end, when you look at that, if you own that asset for 10 years, you pay no capital gains on it. So it's there. It's just a matter of when you're getting it. So I think they're a great mechanism. There just needs to be a lot more clarity shed in how they get done.
You look at interest rates you were talking about. Have you ever, worked with local units of government to do conduit bonds to get, so the banks can have, tax-free bonds and do bank qualified, so they butter the bread on both sides to get you a lower rate? Have you done that? If so, what kind of luck have you had with that?
I've never seen it, and I would be hugely open to it. The cities can lend. It's no different than the deal we're doing with Ultra. Ultra's bonding capacity, because they're a nonprofit, allows them access to capital at, sub 3%. And like you said, having the bond prefers people, so it's tax deferred. I think there is a larger market to people who would like to hold those. But, I think it ultimately, who's the guarantor of that? I mean, they don't want that bond tied to us, because they don't want more or less the underlying asset to be a multifamily building that could potentially fail that the city's on the hook for. So we see a lot of separation to where, most of the cities don't want to get involved in the physical asset, from an exposure aspect.
But doing it, basically converting your promissory note to your bank as a bond,
I haven't seen it done, and I'd love to know more about it. I think it'd be great.
We'll talk afterwards.
Yes.
I'm interested in mixed-use facilities, if you have experience on that and what it's done to perform numbers and so forth.
You know, the only one that we did was in Duluth, Minnesota, a project called Envy. They had a very strong corner, very strong retail base, and they really outperformed what I would see as market rents in traditional strip structures. They were achieving $40 a foot rents, where if you look at our hometown, I mean, seeing a strip center even get $15 a foot, they struggle to get that, and they probably sit at 70% occupancy. So I think it's really about having the right tenant demographic, and having those pre-leases in place. Anything else? Well, thank you for having me. I told Mary I gotta run out of here because I gotta pick my kids up at 3 o'clock in Grand Forks, North Dakota. So, thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Baumtrog. I'm from Minnesota Housing. Thanks for having me this morning. I think that was a great, as he walks out the door, I think that was just a great grounding in what developers look at when they come into a city. Because at Minnesota Housing, we can't fund projects that we don't get applications for. And in order to get applications, you need to come in, and city communities have to have a developer. And so one of the struggles that we see at the state level is just developers wanting to work in regions where we know there's a housing need, but there just aren't developers that are looking or doing the work in the community. So I think that was really good grounding. So I just want to take a little step back and talk a little bit about Minnesota housing and what we're seeing across the state, because I know y'all are from different parts of the state, but there are some really dramatic housing trends that we're seeing that I think you're probably feeling in different capacities. And one of them is just the fact that we don't have enough housing. You know, if you go back and look at statewide, the amount of housing that we've added since the Great Recession, we didn't build anything for about a decade. And in some communities, we hadn't built anything for about 2 decades. So back to the developer perspective, it's hard to get a developer interested in the community if there hasn't been something new in the housing front in the community for 2 decades. That's a lot of hours. Even though, while nothing was being built, households were still being formed. We were still adding people and still generally growing. So we have this mismatch where we continued to grow and we didn't build. And at the same time, the cost to produce housing was going up. So it's more costly to build housing by about 13% versus 20 years ago, while incomes have gone down 1%. Does that make sense? So at the same time, housing costs are going up by double digits. Actually, renter income has gone down 1% over that same time period. So that's the crunch. And that's what we see in every market. I don't think there is really a market we look at that we say, well, that's a healthy housing market, meaning there's vacancies in the community that are affordable to people living and working there, that there's houses for sale that don't, that actually meet what people want to buy. We see a lot of really, older housing that needs a lot of improvement to meet the needs of new home buyers. That's a big mismatch that we see. So at the state level, we're seeing massive, we just didn't produce enough. So that's the number one thing that we see across the state. We just haven't built enough. The other thing that we see is that we need to preserve what we built. Minnesota was like eager beaver back in the 1960s and 70s when the federal government was building housing, whether it was public housing or through USDA RD. We took advantage of that, which is amazing, but that was 40 years ago, and that housing is old. It's coming outside of when it needs to stay in the federal program. So we're at risk of losing a lot of the older housing that's really deeply affordable, and if we lose that housing, we don't get it back at the state level. Those dollars like disappear from the community and go back to DC. And nobody wants that because we already send as a state more to DC than we get back. So Minnesota Housing, I think he did a really great job of walking through, you know, where and why people come to Minnesota Housing generally. And I'm speaking mostly about development here. We do a lot of Minnesota Housing from home ownership all the way, from homelessness all the way to home ownership and kind of everything in between. But I'd say the number one reason why people come to Minnesota Housing is because they have to. No, well, kind of. Is that the gaps between building something that's affordable to people and what people are making, and the cost to produce it. That gap is so big that it just can't be done without significant contributions. I mean, he walked through interest rate buy-downs and tax abatement and buying land for $1. And all of that will still leave you generally with a huge gap. And so that's why people come to Minnesota Housing, because we have a wide variety of programs that are geared towards workforce housing, senior housing, new construction, home ownership, rental. All of it isn't enough, but we have more resources than basically any other financial institution. And why they like to come to us is because we can do it at 0%. And that's what really makes the deals work, is when they're layering. There's one thing, I started in Minnesota Housing like 4 years ago, and I had no idea. I came from Minnesota Management and Budget, worked in the governor's office, and so knew that side of the political and policy-making side of housing. I had no idea that it took like 12 to 16 different funding sources to build an affordable housing project. And that's not by choice. I mean, that's like each layer. I mean, Mary and Tim are shaking their head. Like every layer of funding source is like incremental brain damage that happens on these deals, because it's just like another funder, another requirement, another lender, and it's just awful. So it's not why we want to do it. It's not the way that we choose to do it. It's just in some ways how the federal government chose to build affordable housing back in the 80s was with tax credits primarily. And that's the number one resource, and even with that, it's just still not enough to do the scale that we need. We allocate tax credits and we do tax exempt bonds as well. That's the number one way that we build affordable housing in Minnesota, is through federal tax credits. We're fortunate in Minnesota that we do a lot more in affordable housing than other states, because our legislature has determined that what we get from the feds is not enough to go even touch the surface of the needs. So with what we get from the federal government, we can do about 12 to 15 projects a year, and this is rental, I'm talking new construction and preservation. 12 to 15 every year. That doesn't scratch, and that's statewide. So that's Metro. That's all the bigger Duluth, Rochester, Mankato, Detroit Lakes. It's everything. So if you think about like what the needs are in your community, and we can only do about 1 in every 4 deals that come to us. And it's not because there isn't need. It's not because there isn't a developer that wants to work there and build the housing. It's just we don't have the resources. So that's the number one thing. And I think, I was thinking about, I loved hearing all the 10 projects in 63 minutes. I mean, I came a little bit late, so I didn't catch all of them, but just the breadth of all the work that you do, it all talks about, seems to boil down to like partnerships and relationships. And I think that's a critical role that you all can do in your communities if you're not doing housing, is to raise up the issue and to be that partner. And it's better to have other people than me talk about housing needs in their community and how it relates to other goals, whether it's entrepreneurship or an aging population or whatever the priority is in the region. There's a housing need tied to it. And I think there's opportunities to really leverage the partnerships that you all create through some of your other economic development work, from your infrastructure work, to bring that into the housing space. Because we're still, there's still a lot of communities where there's needs, and there just isn't an organizing group that's really pulling everything together, because it does take a village to really get all of these pieces, all these different funding together. And I know you all are good at getting funding, and it takes a lot of work, but pulling in the ties to the community, because what we see is that where housing has been built, you mentioned Thief River Falls, where a project does get built, it does show other lenders other than the state. When the state gets in, we kind of want to do proof of concept in some ways, of like, hey, look, we built something, it's open, it's fully occupied, it's leased up, it's running well, it's cash flow positive, these are all good. Other lenders, let's see if we can get you to activate in different ways. Just because we can't meet all of the housing needs. The other thing I'd mention is there's just a mismatch between what is getting built and what it needs to get built for it to be affordable to what people are making. And so where we've seen, we're basically, we're meeting every year, we're producing enough housing to keep up with needs each year. But what we're trying to make up for is the fact that we didn't build anything for 10 years. That's the housing crisis in a nutshell, is we just didn't build anything for 10 years. So we're building at the levels that we need to moving forward, but we need about 55,000 rental opportunities across the state to meet the needs that we didn't build for. And when you look at the numbers and get into it, and it's really at the lowest incomes, and that's where then the gaps are the biggest. So in communities that are seeing housing development, we're seeing the nicer, the more luxury, the higher rent, the 2 bedrooms that rent for more than $1,000 per month. That just aren't affordable to a lot of people. It's good for the market and they need it. I mean, in Bemidji, it's been amazing to watch the development on the south shore of the lake and see the growth, but they just haven't built anything for people making, less than $45,000 per year and having it be affordable to them. So that's where we see the biggest gap and biggest mismatch is housing that's affordable. We do a lot of supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, and what we're looking at the state is how do we build housing that's more deeply affordable than what the market is producing, because we feel like as a state agency we should be kind of the anchor and kind of pull down. In some ways it feels weird to pull down rents, but in some communities, if Minnesota Housing doesn't fund and deal in the community, nothing gets built at the affordability, at the rent levels, that people working retail jobs, starter manufacturing jobs, even teachers, where they start off, that they just can't find spots to live that they can afford. One, because there's not housing, but then the housing that is available isn't affordable. So I do think the takeaway that I see in successful projects that come to Minnesota Housing, it's led and it's organized strongly by community. Like every project that gets through has its stories probably, about how it came to be, how it took some starts and some stops and additional support, and somebody locally kind of championing that. There's always local leadership, whether that's city council, a mayor, usually a combination of both, because as he was talking about, it really does take sometimes tax abatement and TIF, and it takes the local community to say, we've got to make housing development a top priority, even though we have all of these other priorities around infrastructure and water and sewer. It really does take a city to say, we're going to use some of our tax base and our tax capacity to build housing. I think that's the #1 way that we see cities really get involved is on waiving the fees and doing things like that. But I see that and I go, well, there's still costs that are occurring, and that's just shifting costs, but that's what it takes to make the numbers work out. And I won't even try to compete with the numbers that he provided to you, but just look at that and just get a sense of the stacking and what it took for a community to build something that's up and running and it's great and it's doing well, but the upfront risk, I think that so many people feel that discourages activity, kind of stops a lot of deals. But I don't, since I've started at Minnesota Housing, when we look at once it gets built and once it gets leased up, I mean, it's fully occupied. And so in some ways it is proving like going through the brain damage, doing what it takes to get a project built, but what it does to them in the community, and it being a foundation in the community, and seeing the families live there, and hopefully adding to the school district population, and just doing a lot of things that bring a lot of community benefits that then can trickle into other areas of the community. I think that's one thing I wish that we could better talk about is the ripple effect of a housing shortage. You don't really sometimes see or feel the cost of not having housing that's adequate to meet the needs, but those are costs that we're missing. We're not getting tax base. We're not, people are focusing on where to live. They're not looking to get their next degree. They're not looking maybe to expand their family. If housing's a problem, that means that doing anything that we want to see in the economic development front is also a problem, because they're just focusing on their housing and otherwise paying too much for their housing. So I'll maybe stop with that. I could probably talk for a little bit more, but I did just want to mention, actually, I will say, there are programs. One of the things that we generally hear is that most of our resources go into the metro area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I'll tell you that is not the case. Over the past full 3 years, I think it's even longer than that, it's about 55% of our competitive resources go to the metro and 45% go to greater Minnesota. And we have programs that are specific and only for spots outside of the metro area. So we have preservation programs that are just for rural Minnesota. We have new construction. We don't have enough, so I'm not going to say that we can meet all of the needs, but we do have programs that are geared specifically to some of the housing challenges that we see in rural Minnesota, because we know that it's a little bit different than the metro in terms of the issues, but in some ways there's a lot of similarities, and we wanted to make sure that there were programs that are available, that they didn't have to compete, or didn't feel like they were competing with some metro issues and needs. So with that, I'll stop there. See if there are any questions.
I have a question. I think you mentioned that you noticed that renter income went down.
Yeah.
Do you know why? What's causing that?
I don't know if I know the root cause, other than it's just the fact of what wages are being paid. I mean, we got in a lot of conversation with the legislature a couple of years ago about, what is workforce housing? And I was really new at the time. And I was tried to lead with data, which I felt would win the argument. It didn't win the argument. It's just I think it's just the jobs, that the starting jobs, and the starting pay is just not increasing with the cost of housing. And when we see, it's not to say that they're not important, but it's just those are what jobs are paying. I don't think there's anywhere in the state where if you have 2 full-time workers making minimum wage, you can afford what's available in the community for a 2-bedroom. It just doesn't exist. So it's just a mismatch with cost of housing and what jobs are paying. Yeah, but when I go through the housing stats, it's never usually an uplifting part. And I do think, unfortunately, I think the problems, housing shortage is going to get worse before it gets better. The previous governor had a housing task force, and they had the state economists come. And her main takeaway was, figure out a way to do what you got to do in this market, because what are you otherwise hoping for? I mean, the only way the housing market would get more... The only way the housing market would get better, from some perspective, in terms of vacancies and other things, is to go through a mini recession. And so figure out, like, in this environment, like, how are we going to produce what we need to keep up? Like, we need to just figure out how to make it happen, because the alternative is not better. It's just another. The other thing I would say is, feel free to reach out to Minnesota Housing if you're interested and you want to know who's working in your community, who's doing housing, who are active lenders in your community on home ownership. Just reach out to us, because we can tell you who's working in your region if you don't know, because I think that's one of the things is making a connection, who's doing what, and who's maybe where there's gaps in your community. There's a handout over here that had like a very like militaristic plan of like assess, plan, act, measure, and I think that fits with housing, right? It's like know what you're dealing with, know what your housing stock is, figure out where the priorities are, figure out where the opportunities are, because I think every community has a story to tell about what their needs are, whether it's aging in place and they need a senior housing so that they can open up some home ownership, whether it's workforce housing because they've got 3 local employers that are busing people in and would rather build housing to keep those tax dollars. Like those are the stories that I think help get developers interested, is when they can tell if there's a compelling need to get away from the Floridas and Californias. Like there is plenty of work to do around here. So I think just getting out and telling the story is one of the biggest things that local governments and localities and people working in areas can do, is just tell the story of your community and why you did it. I see a couple of shirts that says "Get Rural." I love that. I mean, like kind of owning. I
Morning, my name is Levi. I'm with the Headwaters Regional Development Commission in Bemidji. I've been with the company about 2.5 years now. I primarily focus my time on owner-occupied rehab programs, and also we'll do a little down payment assistance and accounting work. But primarily, I focus my time on owner-occupied rehabilitation. And just to ask, what is owner-occupied rehabilitation? Generally, and there's always an exception in every case, it is owners of single-family residences. And it's helping them with repairs to their homes, making their homes safe, affordable, helping with energy efficiency, those kind of things. So that's generally what owner-occupied rehabilitation is. Why owner-occupied rehabilitation? First, to preserve and maintain aging housing stock. As Ryan alluded to, and so did John, construction costs are always increasing. Homes are aging. You know, look in your local communities. There's a lot of older homes in there. You can see the neighborhoods. They're aging. They need help. They need work to be fixed. A lot of them are in disrepair, and help people to stay affordable housing for them. We help people stay in their homes. A lot of the people are generally lower income households, fixed income, Social Security, disability, those type of things. They don't have a lot of means, as other people do, to help them stay in their homes and keep their homes safe and accessible. Also, to promote safety and energy efficiency, you know, a safe place for these people to live. A lot of them are disabled. We need to help them with things to keep them in their homes. You know, ramps and making sure they have grab bars in their bathrooms, all those types of things, making the home safe for them. And also energy efficiency. Things like new windows, heating, electrical, helping them lower their energy bills, those type of things. That's also a goal of the rehab program. What resources are available? This isn't a list of all of them. These are the ones that I generally take advantage of through the work that I do. The first one is the Rehabilitation Loan Program. That is done through Minnesota Housing. That is the one I definitely spend the most time on. It is for low-income households. We'll go through that in a minute. Emergency and Accessibility Loan Program. That's another one. It's kind of supplemental to the rehab loan program. It's another funding source through Minnesota Housing. Can be used for emergencies, also accessibility to the home for people. Impact Fund, that is one that is another resource we can access. We'll go through that in a second also. It's another funding source we can use to help the rehab process. Each one of these has different terms, different loan amounts, all those kind of things. The Small Cities Development Program through DEED. I'm sure you guys at least have heard of that or familiar with DEED. They do have a program for owner-occupied rehabilitation also. So I'll just go through that one. Fix-Up Fund, that one is done through Minnesota Housing. That one is also a fund that we use in conjunction with the other. It's more of a traditional loan product. Can be used for a variety of sources for fixing up your home and that kind of thing. Other resources that are available out there, the USDA through rural development, they have a loan program for low income. I think it's up to max of like $20,000 in a loan. They also have a grant for people 62 and older. Weatherization, that is also out there through your local CAP agency. They do a lot of the energy efficiency So that's out there, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. I haven't dealt a lot in that one. They also have a loan out there that is available through round of funding. And also local resources, your local communities, HRAs, those kind of things. The first one, like I said, is the Rehabilitation Loan Program. It's available through a network of lenders, including myself. You can go to their website, Minnesota Housing, and through the Rehab Loan Program, it'll have a list, as Brian kind of alluded to, of the lenders in your area to see who administers the program. I just checked last night and I could never remember. I think that at Headwaters, we administer the program for 13 counties. The Headwaters, our region is actually just 5, but we administer it for out farther west and to the south, Polk County, all past Mahnomen, Red Lake, all those. So it is a robust program. We do cover for a lot of counties, and it's a good loan. It's up to $27,000, and that would be the max the program offers. It's for eligible repairs to the home, things that affect the safety, habitability, and energy efficiency of the home. In that $27,000, we also have to include things like we have to do a property report, we have to do a lead assessment, any lead work, lead abatement, test for radon, we have to do that. We have to pay inspection fees out of that. There's a multiple of things going on, and we have this $27,000 to use. So when you take that all into account, and then your contractor's bids, a lot of times it doesn't seem to go as far as what you want. It is forgiven after 15 years, and that is for your traditional stick-built house. There is also, which is a good part of the program, is it also is available for mobile homes, which I know is a hard one. I'm sure people have come across that to help those that are in mobile homes. If it is a mobile home that's on a piece of land that the owner owns, it's forgiven after 15 years. If it's a mobile home in a mobile home park, then it's forgiven after 10. So that is one resource that we can access for people that are in mobile home parks to try and help them out. If you look down at the bottom there, it does have the income limits. That is household income, and based on income and household size. It does change. Generally, I think it follows HUD guidelines. I'm not positive. And it changes what I've seen since I've been here, generally every year around May sometime. Also with this, just to take note, contract for deed is eligible. So I have run across that a couple times. It has to be okayed by the contract holder and both parties, but it is a possibility to do a contract for deed. It is not available for secondary homes, investment properties, lake homes, that kind of thing. It's just strictly